Tansi. Good evening. My name is Sikowis, Sikowis Nobiss. I'm Plains Cree Saulteaux of the George Gordon First Nation, and I am the Executive Director of Great Plains Action Society. And I've been living in Iowa for about 15 years, which is why we're here today. We are concerned about CO2 pipelines that are slated to go through this state and quite a few others in the Midwest. And so that's what we're going to be discussing. Also, this is the first episode of a webinar or webisodes, I don't know what you call it, that myself and my partner Mahmud Fitil will be hosting throughout 2022, focused on climate and environment and issues relevant to the Midwest, in terms of what's going on with corporations and extraction, big ag and water issues, and all those things that are important to our health, the health of our earth, the health of all the other living beings. And we will be providing Indigenous perspectives as well as, other opinions on these really important topics, as it was 74 degrees here in Iowa City just a few days ago. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I'd like to welcome Mahmud to the stage to take it from here to provide an overview of what we'll be talking about today, and he will be running the show and introducing our guests as well. Hello, Mahmud.
Hello, Sikowis. It's good to be here with you, friends and family. Everybody out there concerned and/or impacted by the proposed carbon pipelines, which we are facing here in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota. I'm going to start with a bit of an intro overview, I guess, of the topic for tonight. What is CCS? Carbon capture and storage, or alternatively, you may have heard of carbon capture and sequestration, which refers considerably to the process, or ostensibly to the process of capturing CO2 during energy generation and other industrial processes in order to prevent the carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere and thus preventing it from further contributing to and exacerbating this greenhouse gases effect on climate change. Another similar term that you may have heard is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, which would be the same as CCS with the addition of utilization of the carbon that is captured for things such as extreme resource extraction in the form of enhanced oil recovery. It's a type of extreme fracking, if that would make sense to folks out there familiar with the petroleum industry. EOR is a term or process used in the oil industry, which extracted CO2 and water are used to drive up oil from otherwise exhausted or dormant wells, while sequestering the CO2 underground. This is going to be a primary concern to us up in North Dakota around the Bakken region. If you'll recall from the Dakota Access pipeline fight from Energy Transfer Partners, that's the major area or region of North Dakota where they're getting most of that oil. Now, there are two primary forms of carbon capture to consider when we talk about CCS. Those of pre-combustion carbon capture, used primarily during the industrial processes, removing carbon dioxide from the fossil fuel prior to combustion being completed. Pre-combustion is associated with a high-pressure system producing so-called synthesis gas or syngas, which through further processing of carbon monoxide and water is then used to produce CO2 and hydrogen. The hydrogen is destined for further production usages, while the CO2 is then sequestered. Pre-combustion carbon capture, while more efficient, also proves more costly than lower pressure post-combustion carbon capture processes, which we'll discuss a bit next. Post-combustion carbon capture, roughly 30% of all electricity generated in the US is derived from the combustion of coal. Current carbon technologies are projected to dramatically increase the cost of electricity while limiting the production facilities efficiency by up to 20 to 30%, due largely to additional energy requirements in order to capture the produced CO2. When speaking in terms of climate change and reducing CO2 emissions, the absurd premise frequently tied with post-combustion carbon capture is that it may be used to further refine even more fossil fuels, which are also sequestered or stored CO2 underground. Regarding the two proposed projects that we are facing here in Iowa and Nebraska and other states throughout the Great Plains region, the Summit Carbon Solutions Midwest Carbon Express and Navigator CO2 Ventures LLC's Heartland Greenway are going to be our main topics for discussion this evening. What then does this usage of CCS mean? We submit that the proposed purpose of CCS is to continue burning fossil fuels, a clear benefit to the very industry that ultimately created the predicament all people on this planet are now facing, which is quickly defining our era. CCS is unhealthy, dangerous, dirty, expensive, wasteful, and unnecessary. And MIT professor Howard Herzog writes, the rationale for CCS is to allow the continued use of fossil fuels while reducing emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is purported to somehow mitigate global climate change. The premise is that we continue worse still increase the acquisition, burning, exploration, processing, shipment, and storage of fossil fuels as we face a climate emergency is dangerous, radical, and something that we should clearly reject. It was mentioned above the post-combustion carbon capture is linked most frequently to coal. The projects before us publicly stated that they will be tied into the ethanol industry, particularly that of Summit, whose owner, financier, Bruce Rastetter, heavily invested in the ethanol industry. So the Great Plains and the Midwest region are being targeted primarily due to their heavy involvement in corn production and associated ethanol production facilities. No doubt coal-fired electric production facilities, such as those still operation by Mid-America throughout Iowa, may also prove an attractive target source for carbon for these projects. Here are some maps detailing the storage areas for both of the projects Summit posed to store their carbon waste. In Beulah, North Dakota, and Navigator is poised to store their carbon in Decatur, Illinois. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of our folks here that we're going to be speaking this evening. First off, we're going to hear from Brian Jordy of Jordy Group, Law Group out of Omaha, Nebraska, who has successfully fought back KXL for over 12 years. A little about Mr. Jordy. Brian Jordy is a trial lawyer based in Omaha, Nebraska. For the 12 years, he has worked on behalf of landowners around the country, notably for hundreds of farmers and ranchers in Nebraska, protecting their property rights and defending them against eminent domain abuse. Jordy has handled hundreds of lawsuits and hundreds of appeals relating constitutional challenges, property rights issues, and condemnation proceedings for landowners. Jordy has achieved other landowner groups and lawyers across the country and assisted in the developing a legal and strategic architecture for successful fights from coast to coast. He and his law firm are currently representing landowners in Nebraska and Iowa against eminent domain for private gain related to the CO2 pipelines, and is responsible for the multi-state legal strategy regarding landowner opposition to these pipelines.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and for the invitation to be here and speak to you all. As was just said, I've had the pleasure of representing landowners in Nebraska, Wisconsin, and across the country on these very type of issues that we're discussing, of gigantic companies that are ultimately concerned about profit only, coming into various states, essentially trying to steamroll landowners, local officials, local boards, and utilize a power which is eminent domain that is typically reserved for the government to use for projects that are for the public use, such as the interstate highway system or public parks, public hospitals, things that all of us could potentially use. And they are abusing that right of eminent domain by getting laws passed that kind of grease the wheels, so to speak, so that their projects can be greenlit and rubber stamped, oftentimes before anybody in the public really knows what to do or how to stop it, or that it's even going on, or that they have rights to be protected. So my involvement on these type of issues started in earnest about 12 years ago in Nebraska with the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. That company, TransCanada, second largest pipeline company in the world, was tried to steamroll landowners there. Would approach them and tell them they had to sign these documents called easements, and essentially scared and shamed and bullied people into signing away their rights for land that had been in their family for over 100 years in many cases, or more, all without any explanation of what their rights were. And so when we got called in early on from a landowner who had a problem where his elderly mother was bullied and said if she doesn't sign this easement, that the oil company will simply take the land from her, we realized something was desperately wrong. That wasn't the way how to do business in Nebraska or the Midwest or anywhere, frankly, and we got involved. And that took us and all of our landowner clients and others who supported the fight and the resistance on a 12-year battle that just now is ending in earnest. As we sit here today, I'm still wrapping up the final settlement agreements for the last group of landowners that were holdouts for all of those years, and thankful that that pipeline was never built, not only from the environment standpoint, which is critically important. And I, for one, believe in science and believe that climate change is real and there's problems out there. But it's important to remember in these fights that it's a big tent mentality. And early on in Nebraska, no one frankly cared about the environmental impacts of what KXL represented or maybe represented. You have to take yourself back 12 years ago, where the education that's out there today and the understanding simply didn't exist. And so I would share with everyone that it's really important to be open-minded. And when you're building a coalition of landowners and people that want to band together to be stronger than themselves, to united, we're stronger than individually speaking. And to create a group like that early on, it's important to know the motivations. And so in Nebraska, for instance, and in Wisconsin and other places that I've traveled around, uniting landowners and the developing legal strategies around these types of projects and eminent domain abuse, really property rights, frankly, was the thing that galvanized farmers, ranchers, individuals early on. That's an issue that we can all kind of agree on, that constitutional protections of our property rights, being free from eminent domain for private gain, where a company wants to make profits on the back of your land, where you still pay the property taxes for the area of where the pipeline or the project would be located. You still have liability and need to carry liability insurance for any problems that may happen with that pipeline that you can't absolutely prove is not your fault. And then easements and pipelines and other projects, when they have the rights to your land, it prevents you from doing things that you could otherwise do if the land was free from that infringement. And that's really where we had success in galvanizing our group early on. And so we've come so far, but it's important for any of you that are interested in this and fired up and want to get involved and want to build groups. We've got to be careful to not be so narrow that if a landowner maybe isn't instantly on board with the environmental dangers and risks, talk to them on the turf that they're comfortable with. Bring them in to the tent, because what we saw over years of holding the group together and coalescing on, as I said, defensive property rights and no eminent domain for private gain, the trust was built, minds were expanded, and slowly you could evolve into all of the other dangers and risks and the big picture beyond just my piece of land and what this means to me and my family and my economic and constitutional freedoms and abilities to make a living, but to the greater problems when we get into the climate issues and the environmental aspects. And so that's probably my biggest takeaway that I'd like to share, because that was the same experience from state to state. Anyone I would talk to, you'd get asked the same questions. And back then, and even some to now, it's sometimes hard for people to get on board with the environmental message right away. And so don't be discouraged if they're not. Just talk to them in their language and their level. And I think you'll see that we can build a very big network, regardless of what the project is, but certainly on these CO2 pipelines. And as was discussed, myself, my firm, our team, we're involved in Iowa, Nebraska, talking to landowners in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota about what can be done on a 5-state multi-legal strategy basis in terms of organizing and educating landowners and sharing information across multi-states, which is critical to try to mount the defense against these companies that refuse to publish the lists of the people that are impacted, refuse to be transparent about what they're doing. And the only way that you can even have a chance of resistance is by banding together and then sharing information such that you can, and putting the best legal strategies, the best organizing strategies, the best public media, earned media strategies possibly out there that you can. And so we're very fortunate to be involved with a great group of landowners in certainly coming together now in Iowa, Nebraska, and we're slowly developing in the other states, and really pleased to be on board of what could be a pretty exciting movement of education and resistance against what are dangerous projects, not well thought out projects, projects that are ultimately just tax grabs for tax incentives and ultimately destroy property rights and are just a slow slide down a path of any person being able to come up to you and take your property just simply because they have a project that they think they can make money on and they want your land for that purpose. So lots and lots of things I could talk about, and if there's a question answer period at all, I'd be happy to do that. But that's kind of my big picture of what we have done, what we're looking to do, and encourage everyone to always keep a very open mind, because we need all people involved, from right to left and in the middle and super environmental and those that aren't so sure about global warming or climate change. We need all of the people to come in under one tent to resist and have a fighting chance against these companies. I see a question. Can I answer that question, Mahmud? Okay, so I have a question here, and it says, did these companies have government support in attempting to use eminent domain with these landowners? And if so, at what level? Great question. So eminent domain is not just something you have. There's, in every state, there should be a process of whereby you prove the right to be granted eminent domain. But the starting point is if the legislature has put in motion a law that says, for instance, as it does in Nebraska, any pipeline company shall have the right of eminent domain if, and then as long as they can get over these hurdles, which are very low, then boom, they have eminent domain. Typically, you have to prove that your project is for public use, but that's been very bastardized from public use to public benefit to public good, and all sorts of watered down interpretations that have really taken it away from the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which was no private property shall be taken for private gain without, or for private use unless it's for a public purpose. And so it's really through the courts got watered down, but the danger is in each state, these companies have lobbyists, they go to the legislature, they get the bills they want to have a very quick process. And so that the hurdles to prove that their project is public use are so low that they almost can fall over them and win. So be on guard of what your laws are state by state. What type of companies have eminent domain? It might be not surprising to you to learn that solar companies don't have eminent domain. Biofuel companies don't have eminent domain. Solar companies don't have eminent domain. But surprise, fossil fuel and derivatives thereof companies with the most money and the most lobbyists and the most influence in our state legislatures and federal legislature are the ones, surprise, surprise, that have eminent domain powers, as long as, again, they almost fall over these small hurdles. So that's the best way that I can explain that. It's, you got to be involved at every level, because these companies put the laws in place that they want years in advance of even announcing the projects. So by the time you know about it, you're already behind the 8 ball. So stay involved.
Mhm. I believe we've got another question here. What are the impacts of landowners for long-term storage? Gas will seep to every fisher and fracture it can. Western North Dakota is concentrated fractured land.
Yeah, great question. So again, from my legal standpoint, it's should the utility board or the Public Service Commission or the Public Utility Commission, whatever your state might have that oversees pipelines, should they be greenlighting projects that haven't ever been done before from companies that have no track record, and that the whole master plan and the genius, if you will, of their entire project is to put CO2 underground in a 12 by 12 mile area in North Dakota that isn't surveyed, that we don't know where it stops, where it starts, and just hope that CO2 will stay down there and not migrate as gases do and create any type of catastrophic problem. So I think the mileage you get more is the rhetorical question of really what are we doing here? I mean, how can these companies guarantee that there won't be a catastrophic disaster in the future when they really have no idea what the formations look like, can't guarantee it, and aren't putting up bonds in the hundreds of millions of dollars so that there's money on a state-by-state basis if there's a catastrophic explosion or people are killed, as they have been when CO2 pipelines rupture before. So it's a real problem for the people in North Dakota and throughout the Midwest.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. I recall very distinctly from my involvement in the water permit process for KXL up in the South Dakota DENR. They water it down even to the concept of a common carrier in order to prove eminent domain and things like that. So excellent points that you brought up, Mr. Jordy. With the interest of time, to make sure that we get other guests involved, I'm going to go ahead with our lineup, but I would urge you to stay on. We'll probably have a question and answer here towards the end, if that's all right with you.
If you
Sounds
have the
great.
time. We
Yep.
have so many amazing questions. I mean, I'm actually really happy to see all this engagement. And, we'll try to get to all these as we move through the show. And we have a great guest next, Carolyn Raffensperger, who can also help with some of these. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
All right. As Sikowis mentioned, our next up speaker for our lineup tonight is out of the state of Iowa. I figure we'd start here in Iowa. That's where we're based right now, currently. And we'll move our way up along the pipeline route, probably Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and finish up in North Dakota. Carolyn Raffensperger is founder and director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, SEHN. She's based out of Iowa here. And as an environmental lawyer, she specializes in the fundamental changes in law and policy necessary for the protection and restoration of public health and the environment. Carolyn has been and is still heavily involved in stopping the Dakota Access pipeline. She's been involved in fighting back KXL with us for over a decade and is currently working to shed more light in the detrimental effects of these CO2 pipelines and the greenwashing tactics being used by their proposed industry and corporations. We've become great friends here over the years. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Carolyn.
I'd also like to add, Carolyn, near the end of your talk, I might pop up a couple questions. I know that you'll be great at answering, if that's okay. Oh, you're on mute.
We can fix that.
Nice.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. It's such a pleasure to work with both of you. And I want to start out with a quick summary of what you said, Mahmud, to set the stage for some of the other things I'm going to say. What is carbon capture and storage? And especially with the kinds of plans that they've got here in Iowa. And the first part is they're going to put this gigantic technology on top of ethanol plants that's going to capture the carbon. And it's going to take a vast amount of energy, even more energy to capture the carbon than already is required to make the ethanol. And then they're going to take that carbon dioxide and they're going to compress it, pressurize it into a supercritical liquid and force it through pipelines across the land, across the rivers, across our precious states. And then they are going to do one of two things. Either they're going to force more oil out of already depleted oil fields, or they're going to bury it deep underground. So the last stage in that, the capture it, move it through the landscape, and then do something with it, is to rake in public subsidies. So one of the key elements of this whole scam on the part of both companies that are trying to put carbon dioxide pipelines through our landscape is they cannot do business without using other people's property. They cannot make a profit without using other people's property, whether it's a landowner's land or whether it's public money. So there are vast subsidies for carbon capture and sequestration, vast. They will essentially make their profit off of our money, public money, things that we have contributed to the common good for roads, for libraries, for parks. And they will instead hand it over to Bruce Rastetter and his cronies to line their pockets. And so this is one of the reasons that you're seeing very unusual bedfellows. Environmentalists don't often agree with private landowners in these cases, and yet we've come together in significant numbers to oppose this. And that should be a tell. What do you see when you get very unusual political alliances and group alliances like this? It should tell you that something is wrong with this picture. If the private landowners and the environmentalists have come together and oppose this, it should tell you that it's not a climate solution, which is what they're telling you it will be. It is not for the public good. It is for their private gain. So I want to speak a little bit about why environmentalists actually care about this. And that is that it's being proposed as this climate solution. I happen to have been a judge recently in an international tribunal on the rights of nature. And you have heard about the interests of landowners and that private companies here proposing to take private land. In the case of many of the Iowa farmers and the Great Plains farmers in northern South Dakota, Nebraska, and elsewhere, what we know is that these farms have been in families for generations. Those people have protected their land, worked their land, passed it down to future generation, to the next generation for decades, if not 100 or more years. And there are environmental consequences for this as well, which is why we have joined forces with them to oppose it. So it is not a climate solution. As I mentioned, it takes huge amounts more energy to capture the carbon in the first place than if you just went and put another solar facility or a wind turbine right across the street from it. It will require huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of money to actually capture that. More important, because of that increased use of energy to capture the carbon, you are creating more carbon dioxide than you were creating before. Why not just use that money and invent those technologies and use technologies that actually address climate change? In the International Tribunal for the Rights of Nature, which recognizes that nature herself has rights that are a lot like ours, that nature and the ecosystems in which we live have a right to their own integrity. They have a right to be respected. They have a right not to be commodified. So I've lived most of my life in grasslands, whether it's tall grass prairie or the mixed grass prairie in North Dakota, both states that I love a lot, mostly because I love the open sky, the big open sky that graces the prairies and the plains with its extraordinary presence. And the International Tribunal for the Rights of Nature said, this is a false climate solution that violates the rights of nature. Now, how does it do that? One is it's a delaying tactic by the fossil fuel industry to actually address climate change. We're just going to keep making ethanol, adding it to gasoline. The fossil fuel industry and the ethanol industry are opposing electric cars in Iowa because it's going to threaten the ethanol industry and the ability for Bruce Rastetter and others to make money and profits off of ethanol, all the while contributing more carbon dioxide and not stopping the production of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Climate change is threatening our lives. It is threatening the natural world. Today I saw a flicker, and they normally come through in March and September, and it's out of season. I saw a vulture the other day. The number of trees that blew down in the derecho left bats and others without homes. And we have now had 2 derechos, massive straight line winds that blew down the homes of bats and flickers and so many of the creatures that we adore, that, the bird watchers go out to watch these magnificent creatures in their migrations and flying through. So climate change itself is a threat to nature. But what about the carbon dioxide? It's pressurized, and so isn't that, we breathe, we exhale CO2. So what's the problem? Isn't CO2 a benign material? It is not. In the first place, concentrated like that and pressurized, it is both toxic. You try and hold your breath and you accumulate too much carbon dioxide, and you can die. If you put a plastic bag over your head, don't have oxygen, you can die because of carbon dioxide. It's an asphyxiant. So we've had a big accident in Sikowis, Mississippi, where the carbon dioxide pipeline exploded. And because the CO2 moves along the ground, it's heavier than air, it just moves along the ground. And because it has no smell, you won't know what hit you. You will not know that the equivalent of that plastic bag has been put over your head. It will kill you. And it will kill all breathing things, including, by the way, your car, which is not a living thing, but it's a breathing thing. The combustion in that car is dependent on oxygen. And in Sikowis, Mississippi, where that pipeline exploded, their cars wouldn't start. So even if you knew there was a problem and you tried to get away in your car, you couldn't. But neither can the animals. Neither can that beautiful engineer, the great engineer of the world, the beaver, move away from the river. Your cows, your horses, your dogs, the deer, they cannot get away from this, and they will die. So this is a violation of the rights of those creatures to live and to be themselves, to have their own homes and habitats untainted by this kind of nasty, nasty material. But it also does something terrible to water. If that carbon dioxide leaks, then it will acidify the water. It's what's happening with the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It is acidifying the oceans and dissolving the shells of like clams, the shells of shellfish. They can't survive our acidification of water, and neither will the freshwater beings. Anything that carbon dioxide, any water that carbon dioxide touches will acidify it. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to the last really grievous thing that this would do. Their plan is to inject it deep into the earth. We know so little about the equivalent of the coral reefs. My dear friend and colleague, Sandra Steingraber, has said that deep below the earth's surface is like coral reefs. There are living things down there that we know very little about. These are unexplored areas, and maybe should be left alone. Maybe we should let the mystery of that deep world exist. But we know that there are living communities of things, and that when we inject carbon dioxide into those worlds, into those coral reefs of living things, we will fundamentally alter their homes, their ability to thrive and to survive. We have no right to do that. We have an obligation to the natural world on which our lives, we are part of nature, humans are part of nature, and to destroy our home through our ignorance, through our folly, and through our greed, we have no right. And on behalf of future generations, on behalf of the children of parents that I know are listening here and their grandchildren, on the part of the beaver and that flicker, their babies, and those creatures in the deep below world, I say this is not right. This is an injustice, and we will stand for justice for the natural world and for future generations of all beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
I'd like to thank you for those insights, Carolyn. I also wanted to mention, there's a real concern that the water could be salinated, freshwater wells. And we know it all throughout rural America, a lot of folks rely on their freshwater wells in order to draw up their water for both their cattle, for themselves. Aquifers, we were protecting the Ogallala Aquifer and the High Plains Aquifer against KXL. And I know that that's definitely a concern by shoving a bunch of carbon dioxide under the ground, that perhaps it would push up salt and spoil some of those wells, making them go from sweet water to brackish or salt water and rendered unusable.
Yeah, so I know quite a bit about North Dakota. Since I come from there, my family has land there, that we had a well, and we, our cattle are dependent on well water, and it's saline already. You get saline seeps on our farm. We have land near Medina and near Jamestown, and there's saline seeps, and if there's cross contamination because you forced this carbon dioxide into the pore space, other things the water and the salt have to go somewhere. Where will it go? And they're arguing that there's going to be a cap of hard rock over this, that they're going to inject it deep down into below that cap rock, but they don't know. We are running blind when it comes to that deep below the Earth's surface. We have no right to do it.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, which is a reason why we also have a focus on, Indigenous lands and territories as part of this forum today. Because so far the conversation has generally revolved around, white landowners in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and how they're being affected via eminent domain. And their input on this is very important because obviously they are the owners now of this land, and so that's the first defense or offense, if you will, to stop these pipelines from coming in. However, we cannot forget that all of this land is stolen. We cannot forget that as we get into, actually, let's not even forget that these are Meskwaki lands, and we're going to have Danielle Wanati come up here right away and speak about that. But, that this is going through Nebraska, South Dakota, into North Dakota, and most likely, eventually, my guess is to the Mandan Hidatsa territories, Riccara territories, where obviously there's been a lot of drilling going. Let's not forget that this might also follow the Dakota Access pipeline easement. This is the Summit pipeline, I believe. Navigator, we don't know yet. There's so much information to get out right now. It's like there's just it's unbelievable. The questions coming in are fantastic. I'm so sorry we can't answer them at the moment because we're trying to honor our guests and their time. But we will try to get to them at the end. I don't know, Carolyn, if you want to stick around, we would love it. But I understand if you have things to do. But yeah, if you want to hang out backstage, maybe we can bring you back on a little later and answer some of these really important questions that people are asking. The engagement is great. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I'll be here.
Thank you. All right. So, yes, we definitely need to speak about this issue from Indigenous perspectives. Carolyn brought up a great point. Like Vandaloria has said said many years ago, sacred lands do not just exist on the ground. They go to the middle of the earth. They go out into the universe. These lands, these areas, like what is considered sacred, doesn't just exist on top of the earth. And what happens underneath, in these caverns, in these spaces, many of our origin stories come from under the ground. What does that mean in terms of what's going on under there? I mean, these origin stories, also are very much linked to scientific findings. We know that there's important things going on under there. What are we going to do when we put this water there, or whatever it is? So I would like to bring Danielle up on stage now. Danielle Wanati. Hello, Danielle.
Hi.
And we're just really glad you could be here and talk about these pipelines are within Meskwaki territories, and we'd love to hear your perspective on what you think about all this.
Real quick, if we might go ahead and introduce Danielle to the audience who may not be familiar. Danielle
Yes,
Wanati,
thank you so much. Thank you.
She's a Meskwaki tribal member, otherwise known, federally recognized as the Sac and Fox in the Mississippi and Iowa. She is in the beginning stages of organizing a run for water and to bring awareness to all the issues that are currently fighting in our communities. Danielle was a strong Indigenous leader during the grassroots resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline project, both here in Iowa as well as Standing Rock. Without further ado, Danielle Wanati.
Hi, thank you. Well, it's another pipeline fight. It's threatening our water. And like Christine said, that Indigenous people have to be aware of this kind of stuff, not just for our own safety and well-being, but for all humanity within our country, because this is another threat to our water. And like Carolyn was saying, we don't actually know what this is going to do when you start injecting or start transporting the CO2 through a pipeline. We don't know enough about it to be injecting it into anywhere. It's also a form of rape towards Mother Earth when you don't know actually what's going to happen and how they're going to go about it. It's just another way for these companies to make profit and to gain some kind of money off of it and try to see what they could get away with. We first started seeing what they could get away with when they utilized eminent domain for private gain during the Dakota Access pipeline, or they call themselves the Bakken Pipeline or Energy Transfer Partners. So we've already seen what they're capable of doing. And I don't know, this is just a scary thing, not just for Iowans, but for everybody who isn't aware of this, because this is what these companies do, is they start going ahead of all the permits and that are required of them. Like what we've seen when Iowa Utility Board gave them permission and they said they had to have permits before they started digging. They didn't have the permits before they started digging. So we have to wait and see what they're going to do now. And I don't think we have to wait anymore. We can actually stop them if we want to, and it's through court proceedings, because they are in violation of some key components when applying for permits in the state of Iowa. And Indigenous people, we are aware of this forked tongue speaking that the white man gives to people when they want to gain profit or gain money off of this kind of things, off of taking of resources and assets that are meant for humankind and human beings. Yeah, so once this comes up, I don't understand how a CO2 pipeline can be used next to an oil pipeline and how nobody sees that as a threat to all of us within the state of Iowa. So that's how come I'm gonna have to start organizing another run to bring awareness to all of these issues, because all the issues that all organizations are fighting are somehow tied together. They're all related, just like we are all related to each other somehow. Once you contaminate this water, it affects all of us. It affects our medicines. It affects our children. It affects our elders. We breathe water in our mother's womb before we breathe air on this earth. So you understand how much our body needs this kind of water. And I don't know. All of this seems like another Groundhog Day type of scenario where now we're starting to fight this pipeline, another pipeline. And when will it end? When are they going to start listening to what we actually care about, which is each other and human beings as a whole? I don't know. It surprises me that we come to this point again when we know nothing about this CO2 capture and transportation of it through pipelines, that now we're all gung-ho about it and the state is all allowing all these permits. So I suggest everyone just start reaching out to their representatives, start asking them all these questions, because it's going to go through your counties. It's going to infringe on your rights, and that's your right to public information and to know this kind of stuff. There's nothing wrong with utilizing your First Amendment and speaking up and creating a big stink about it because you don't know anything about it. I'm pretty sure none of the elected officials know anything about it. I'm pretty sure Iowa Utility Board doesn't know enough about it to be allowing any permits to anybody pertaining to this pipeline.
And speaking of that, I wanted to note that a couple of people have asked questions about where they can go to public meetings. I know you're very familiar with that.
You should be aware to kind of sneak about it. They try to hold public forums, and when they allow it, they don't give it out to the public right away. Iowa Utility Board has to post when their meetings are going to be, but you have to be aware of it because they try to be sneaky and post it like a day before. And they have these secret meetings with some of these pipelines, and you have to just be aware and just be a thorn in their side all the time and be seen, be heard, make sure you look at them. And that's what I'm going to do at every meetings. It's just hard work. I hope to see a lot more of you people out there, along with Carolyn, Mahmud, and Christine, and all of us that have been fighting pipelines for the past 5 to 7 years and so. And we're not tired enough that we're not going to stop. We're going to keep fighting, even if we have to crawl over there and stop it ourselves. I don't know. Like, I'm ready.
Yeah,
I'm
You
ready.
are. You always are.
good words, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
We're about ready to move on to the Nebraska portion, but I just wanted to mention as well, you noted the former governor of Iowa, Terry Branstad. He's weighed in publicly on this, sort of abusing his previous public office and notoriety in the fact that he's pushing these carbon pipelines. And I would also like to remind everybody, in order to get DAPL passed and to get it pushed through, he did go ahead and appoint 2 new members of the 3-member board of the Iowa Utilities Board. So they are kind of sneaky. They're hiring former politicians with good name recognition throughout the state. And they do things like shuffle the board if the board is seeming to take the interests and concerns of the public to heart and really examine the issue.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle. And we will be doing a lot more very soon.
Yes, we will.
All right, we're going to move into Nebraska next. I'm going to go ahead and bring on our dear friend, Michelle Free Lemire. She's Ho-Chunk and Ojibwe of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska. She's a member of the Wolf Clan in the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska and a descendant of the Mills Lac band of Ojibwe. She's an educator at the Ho-Chunk Renaissance Language and Cultural Program in Winnebago, a single mother to a beautiful, powerful Indigenous young person, and they both study and teach Indigenous plant knowledge. Thank you for joining us this evening, Michelle.
In listening to all these people speak about the risks that people are facing, all I can think about is all these different groups, the landowners, the tribes, the rural communities that are being threatened. And it's difficult to, keep quiet about who it is we're being threatened by. A handful of wealthy white men. They already have more than enough money that they couldn't even spend it in their lifetimes, but they still have to have more. I mean, this greed is insatiable and there is no cure for it. And every community that's being threatened is going to have to fight back. There has to be unity in our responses. We have to hit them from every angle that we can. Back in 2016, we gave the fossil fuel industry the fight of their lives, and until the orange one got in there, we did win that. But the thing that we walked away from is experience. Our lawyers, our legal teams, they learned how to fight back. They learned all the loopholes. They learned all the tactics that the fossil fuel industry likes to use. And they've sharpened their teeth. And we have a lot more defenses than we did before. So that's going to be to our advantage. The money that they have behind them is always going to be our disadvantage, because they can buy any politician that they want to buy. They can grease as many palms as they need to. They can buy, environmental boards. They can buy licenses and whatever else they want. And all we have on our side is righteousness, and that's all that we're going to need. As for tribal interests and tribal risks, the biggest risk that we're facing right now is going to be to our culture and our future generations. Because even if they don't run a pipeline directly through tribal lands, or if they don't put the sequestration right on tribal land, if they just put it even close enough, they can threaten our water supplies. And even if it doesn't go directly into the tribal land, so much of that water spreads throughout our whole land, and it goes further than any single tributary alone. And when I teach the indigenous plant knowledge classes, there are certain plants that we can't harvest because so much of our water is already contaminated, usually through farming, conventional farming methods. And if there is some type of a pipeline rupture anywhere near our tribal lands, we're not going to be able to harvest the plant medicines that we need to in order to stay healthy and to stay alive and to maintain our culture and to maintain even our language, because there's so much that we're going to lose. And because of that, we have to remain vigilant, and we have to stand up for those future generations, because so many of our young people don't have the luxury of spending their time shopping at the mall and ignoring what's going on with the climate and with the land. So many of our young people have to pay attention. So many of our young people already know what we're facing and the anxieties that it causes them. It causes them to be fearful of their own futures, to wonder if they're ever going to be able to have their own children. And though our kids are already dealing with the intergenerational traumas that all of us have to face, but to have that on top of it, it's difficult for our young people. But we have to, as Indigenous people, we have to stand up, and we have to live those inconvenient lives where we can't just sit around and relax and watch our favorite TV shows. We have to actually get up off our couches and stand up to all these threats that our young people are facing. And we have to stand up to the threats to our culture and the threats to our water, our medicines, our way of life. I mean, we're just now getting these things back, and it seems like the more we get back, the more we have to fight. And we can't afford to not fight. And we have to make sure that we take whatever measures we need to take in order to protect our land and protect our water. We have to educate ourselves. We have to pay attention to what's going on around us. We can't ignore it. We can't, we don't have that luxury to live comfortable lives. That's something that we're not going to have, that we probably should never have, because there's so many threats from so many different angles.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing all of this information to us. If you wouldn't mind hanging out with us, perhaps people will want to engage at the question and answer. I always appreciate hearing you as a traditional knowledge keeper. And we're going to go ahead and introduce some folks here from South Dakota to speak up next. We've got Chase Jensen of Dakota Rural Action. And Chase Jensen is Dakota Rural Action, a community organizer and staff lobbyist. He grew up in Minnesota, Nebraska, and studied in South Dakota. After completing graduate studies in Texas, Chase worked as a director of education at a nonprofit farm before migrating back north to join DRA. So he's lived in and participated and been part of the community of at least 3 of the 5 states impacted by this project. I'll go ahead and introduce Chase. Thank you.
All right, there we are. Yes, thank you. And thank you both for hosting and helping facilitate this all, inviting us as well from South Dakota. So in South Dakota, we are, as maybe has been noted, a little bit behind where Iowa is, and probably yet a little bit behind where Nebraska is. And right now, kind of in the phase of opposing this pipeline, we're still trying to build our base, still trying to reach out to landowners, get people involved. A lot of people who are being directly crossed here are, unless they have talked to their neighbor, the only thing that they know about this pipeline is what the company has said about it in their letter. And like I'm sure everybody in each state found out, when the company did hold public meetings, they made sure that it was right in the peak of harvest, and at times that weren't very easy for farmers or ranchers to make it to, which I'm sure was just a simple misunderstanding, right? But a lot of people just haven't been contacted. Right now, as far as we know, Dakota Rural Action is one of the only groups really seeing this as an issue that we're taking on in South Dakota. And so if our members hadn't reached out to us, we wouldn't have even been aware, because it's been so quiet, so under the table. What we've been seeing as our work with the landowners currently is a lot of people have, especially right on the southeastern corner, they have already been crossed by Dakota Access. They've been riled up, been very mad by that. But one of the benefits that this company has given us, which has sort of been also named by multiple presenters, is that they're ticking off so many people, so many groups of people who typically wouldn't be on the same side of the aisle on these types of issues, that the more people we find, they're mad for different reasons, and then they have a whole group of people that they want to bring into the coalition as well. In the southeastern part of our state, there's a group of motivated landowners who were crossed by Dakota Access, who were some of the very last people to settle with the company. And so they've gone through the whole legal process. They've opposed, they've hired attorneys, they've done everything you can do, testified in our Capitol. There's a lot of experienced people who've been crossed by previous pipelines. These networks, interstate, interorganizational networks, already have relationships. And so in the midst of any of these fights, you step into it never entirely confident, because it's a huge opponent. You're always the underdog in a way. But these pre-existing relationships are allowing everybody to be much more responsive, much more proactive against this issue. Right now, we've had 5 or 6 community meetings across the state, and we have a growing network of people who've signed up, and we're currently trying to transform that group of people on a mailing list into people who are into a legal representation block, because we do think that that's going to be the best way we can oppose this, is by getting a collective legal group or a group of landowners together who seek legal representation together. And we've been in talks with Mr Jordy, who presented earlier. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to get a big enough, strong enough voice, and hopefully not just in South Dakota, but all along the region. If we have, in my mind, I have this mental map that has absolutely no evidence base behind it, right? But thinking of the whole regional pipeline, and thinking of all of the places, all the farmers, all the landowners, all the groups, all of the tribes, all of the impacted citizens, the schools that are across from this who are opposed. And pretty soon, hopefully, we'll have a map that would be as long as the pipeline is, of people who are not only opposed, but they're arm in arm, unified against it. So I know that the people on the ground here in South Dakota have been very encouraged anytime that I share about the wonderful work being done in these other states. And we have a lot of gratitude as well, because a lot of these other presenters have put out excellent resources and webinars and fact sheets that we've been able to just grab and run with as we catch up. So that's a little bit what's going on here.
Fantastic information, Chase. Thank you. I do note in the comments, some of them here are asking what kind of a unified response. Now, we do know and understand, as many of us were this is our second, third round fighting different pipes. A lot of us are tenured and 10 years plus in the KXL fight across Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, etc. We again rejoined forces and fought back DAPL, gave them a run for their money, and for the first time ever, we saw the fossil fuel industry blink. So we understand from some situational reports that were given out after a Freedom of Information Act request that coordination, strong unified fronts are going to deplete their resources, are going to dilute their messaging, and are going to give us the best chances at winning. And that's part of what we are attempting to do here by bringing all of our coalition together. We're meeting regularly. We're having national calls. We're having regional calls. We're trying to coordinate our efforts amongst one another as organizers, as concerned citizens, tribal members, etc. And we do hope to be very successful in our counter offensive against these corporations. Summit, for example, has never ever been involved in any type of pipeline whatsoever. That is a key difference from other opponents that we faced, such as Energy Transfer Partners or TransCanada, who they're in the business of petroleum pipelines. They're in the business of pipelines. So Summit is a really nascent or immature organization trying to dabble their fingers in something that they're really not sure of. And we hope to beat them back. It seems like it's just a ploy by Rastetter to go ahead and prop up the ethanol industry, which he's already heavily invested in. And there are those of us that care about our communities, care about the land, care about the water. Regardless of our political stripes, we all see this as a threat to our well-being, and we're going to give them a run for their money. I'd like to thank you for your comments here tonight, Chase. I'm going to go ahead and continue on our discussion a bit. Next up, we have our speaker, Mr. Joseph Whiteeyes, out of South Dakota. Joseph Whiteeyes is a Cheyenne River Sioux tribe Lakota. He is a member of Direct Action Coordinator with the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective and does community national support for grassroots mobilizations against fossil fuels and extractive industries. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joseph Whiteeyes.
Hey, thank you. For allowing me to join. Thank you on behalf of the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective for joining the coalition that formed in Iowa.
I'm going to interrupt just a little bit, Joseph. We can't hear you very well.
Hold on.
It's like you're really far away.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, that's like, yeah, that's so much better. Thank you.
Okay. Alrighty, so I'm having difficulty hearing you now, but
Can you hear me now? I had it on mute. So
yes, yeah, I can hear you
okay.
faintly.
All right. So, but we don't have to hear us so much. We just want to hear you. And I will tell everybody that you're on the 38+2 ride right now, right? So
Yeah, no, I'm on the Wounded Knee Survivors
I mean,
ride,
yes.
the Wounded Knee ride.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Bigfoot
Yes.
ride.
The Wounded Knee ride. So if there's a bit of static and whatever, everybody, I just wanted to let you know that. So thank you so much for being here, Joseph.
Well, Cooksia, we're remembering, correct?
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Is there like a list of questions you wanted to ask, or just anything in particular that you wanted me to speak about?
What do you think the impacts of these CO2 pipelines will be in South Dakota? Of course, as Indigenous peoples, we always know that about predatory economics. We know about encroachment into our territories. And we know that they always affect us very greatly. We would just love your thoughts on these issues surrounding these CO2 pipelines.
Yeah, so this CO2 pipeline is just, like Mahmud said, it's just another round of pipelines that we'll be fighting. As you mentioned, that we fought against Keystone XL, which we successfully defeated, and we fought against DAPL going through the east end of the state as well, up above Standing Rock. And the territory that this carbon pipeline will be going through is traditional Nakota and Dakota territory on the eastern part of the state of South Dakota. And, as being a part of the Oceti-Sakowin, they're some of our closest relatives, having those bands or those tribes in that area. And, when it comes to an issue with the land, it becomes an Indigenous issue. And that's why, we formed this organization called the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective to not just work in our communities, but also help support and help work alongside, stopping the fossil fuel extractive industries from really contaminating our lands, our water, and keeping everything, as naturally based as it possibly can. Back in, I think it was October, November, the Summit Carbon Solutions, they were having these meetings in Aberdeen and Redfield and all over the eastern side of the state. And we were fortunate enough to end up making it to a couple of these meetings that they were having. They were just not introducing what this pipeline was, what it'll be carrying, and where it'll be going. And one of the biggest things we noticed is that when there was a group of three of us, myself, Danny Grassrope, and Juania Locke, once we walked in the room got quiet. Our white allies just stopped and looked at us like they were expecting some big noise from us or expecting some rebel rousers to be entering into the room. The company itself, the three presenters that they had up there, they also, kind of paused and just really checked us out. And we went and sat in front of the room. We were just sitting there listening. We didn't have nothing to say because we were, just learning about this as well, trying to figure out who the hell these people are and what they're trying to do with our lands and our relatives' lands, most of all. And, what we got from those meetings was, the landowners really didn't want this to go through. There was a few landowners that got up and spoke, and they all talked about something called eminent domain. And they asked, that was one of the first questions asked up in Aberdeen and in Redfield, is will this company use eminent domain on the landowners? And they said, one of the representatives from Summit Carbon Solutions mentioned that, well, we wouldn't want it to go that far, or we wouldn't like to go that route, is what they said. And for us as Indigenous people, having treaties with the United States of America and really using that eminent domain, what they've used, through the DAPL, through KXL and all of that stuff, we we realized, and I myself have personally realized that, you know, these white people, these white ranchers that have lived here for, you know, over 100 years now, have just as much as a connection to this land as we do. And I think, you know, when an indigenous person walks in the room, you know, a lot of, like, especially a lot of the white people in South Dakota, they get really like shaky or iffy, or they don't know how to speak with us or talk to us. And it's just as simple as, you know, coming up, introducing yourself and saying hello. And from there, you know, coalitions form, groups form, allyships form. And so we started talking with a few individuals. There was an individual from Dakota Rural Action that also mentioned something, that they were going through the states as well, trying to get the landowners organized. But and so we were interested in working with them, but we haven't heard much about this pipeline or from the company. So we started creating a timeline. There's a group of us from Cheyenne River, Standing Rock, and the Sistenwapton Sioux tribe that formed a little group, and we're started slowly educating ourselves to getting to know what was going on with this and where it's going to lead. And we ended up finding out that this pipeline is going to be following almost the same exact route as the DAPL. And one of the biggest issues there too, you know, on top of eminent domain with those white cattle ranchers or farmers or whatever you want to call them, that was their biggest interest, and it added, you know, an extra 50 feet on each side of the pipeline following that already 150-foot easement on the DAPL route. So it easily makes 150 to 250 feet of land that, you know, possibly but won't be able to, you know, grow anymore or produce anything on it, and especially going through our waterways. And it's just been a trip learning about what a carbon pipeline is, and, you know, finding out that there's over 5,000 miles of carbon pipeline throughout the country already. And another fact that we ended up finding is that there's over 100 deaths of workers that work on carbon pipelines a year. And, you know, if there's already 5,000 miles of carbon pipelines in the ground, and that's 100 deaths a year, you know, this extra 2,000 miles is going to add another 40 deaths on top of that 100 deaths a year. So it's going to be, you know, we're going to be looking at over 140, you know, deaths by, you know, the extractive industries or whatever you want to call them. So.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I know you had to drive up a hill to get some reception, so we really appreciate your time. And we will, you know, obviously be in touch, and we will be working towards building a large regional coalition and making sure that they don't get their way.
Yeah, for sure. Keep it in the ground. We don't need
right.
that. It makes absolutely no sense to have this carbon pipeline.
No, it does not.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
It's always a pleasure seeing you again, Joseph. Take care. Next up, we're going to bring on another DRA member, Frank James, the organizer and executive director up there at Dakota Rural Action. Frank is currently Dakota Rural Action staff director. He's began organizing in the late 1990s with DRA. Since then, he's been the staff director at the Idaho Rural Council and regional organizer with the Western Organizations of Resource Councils. Frank has experience building organizations, training staff members, building coalitions, developing grassroots strategies, and had a rather large part in fighting KXL with us up there in South Dakota. I'll go ahead and bring you on. Happy to have you with us tonight, Frank.
Thank you, Mahmud. And I'll tell you what, I appreciate everyone who's been on the call. And I'll try and be quick so we can continue on. But I am the director of Dakota Rural Action, which is a grassroots organization that's organizing landowners and concerned people on stolen lands here in South Dakota. Stolen lands of many people, but largely the Oseti Sequoian, and for me personally and my family, from the Dakota people. What I want to talk about are the strategies that we are using in addition to the organizing that Chase spoke about. So one of the things that Brian mentioned was eminent domain. And in South Dakota, the eminent domains are laws are really horrible as they treat landowners. And in 2012, we introduced a bill to try and change that. And it lost in the House. It got through committee, lost in the House by one vote. And so this year we're looking to reintroduce a bill like that would raise the bar for pipelines that want to access that piece of very powerful legal toolage that allow them to take private lands. In addition, we're working with Dr. Joseph Robertson, who's a member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton, and he is a data scientist and is working to build maps for us that we can use to identify a lot of things, but identify landowners cross, because as we've heard, the pipeline and the government agencies involved with them are not forthcoming with the people that are being affected. And so a lot of people get left out in the cold because they're just not being contacted by anyone. So the first thing we're going to do with this map is build a list that we can reach out to. The GIS software and the expertise of Dr. Robertson, who is wicked smart, really leave a lot of things that we can do with that to help us with our organizing. I'm kind of excited about it as a tool that really helps us, because it's a place-based issue, and the technology is focused on what's going on in spatial representations of the place. Thirdly, I want to mention this, but this is all being driven by federal policy, and it's being driven by the same people who years ago were screaming "drill, baby, drill." When President Biden got elected, they all of a sudden became environmentalists, and now they're screaming we can save the planet and the climate by creating a marketplace for carbon. And agriculture should get on board with this and start building these pipelines and other things to play a part in this carbon. And this is all a part of like narrative and what's the story we're telling, because we do believe that agriculture has a role to play in reducing carbon and helping solve the climate crisis. But it isn't through a marketplace. It isn't through figuring out a way to make money off of another commodity. It's by promoting and working on farming practices that are regenerative and sustainable, which is another thing DRA does a lot of. And I'll leave it at that, but I thank you again for pulling this group together.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I know that on one hand, they're really trying to push the ethanol and seeing a story to corn producers that, this is going to prop up the industry. It's going to lock in ethanol. It's going to secure them a marketplace so that they can go ahead and continue selling their crops. But on the other hand, it's been proven scientifically through studies and other things that having these pipelines traverse through your land, it creates lower farm yield. It makes the land less productive. I know up there throughout South Dakota, you guys are famous for sunflower production, hay, corn, a bunch of other things. And then you've got a very vibrant ranching market as well. If one of these things were to leak, it would take out a whole herd of cattle. So these are also, things to consider. They're busy walking around kind of, I hate to use the word, but pimping this technology is something that's going to, revolutionize and save the planet and allow us to continue the usage of fossil fuels into the future. And really what we need to do is transition into renewables and keep it in the ground. Thank you very much for your insights, Frank. Next up, we're going to go ahead and bring on some folks that we've got from North Dakota. Territory is known as North Dakota nowadays, but the traditional lands, of course, of many Indigenous folks. Lisa DeVille is a Mandan Hidatsa Arikara tribal member of Fort Berthold. She's a longtime environmental activist in North Dakota, fighting to get protections for her community surrounding the impacts of oil and gas. Lisa DeVille is from Mandaree, North Dakota, on the Fort Berthold Reservation, and she is enrolled citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation.
And we're having a little technical glitch with Lisa. Lisa, if you can hear me backstage, if you could connect your camera, then I can add you to the stage. But we can give you a couple minutes for that. And why don't we go ahead and introduce Scott?
All right. While we're trying to figure out a couple technical difficulties there with Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Scott Sikowis of Dakota Resource Council. Scott is the Executive Director of Dakota Resource Council, a conservation and family farm advocacy organization. Scott has over 10 years of organizing experience working in public policy, politics, and community organizing, and is known for his expertise in energy policy, which plays a big role up there in the state of North Dakota. Welcome, Scott.
Hi. Thanks for having me, guys. I guess from my perspective, I've been watching, just from like the perspective of North Dakota, we've been watching our government cheerleading for this project for several years at this point, and projects like it, mainly carbon capture for coal. So I kind of wanted to give you guys a little bit of a rundown of what we've noticed over the last couple of years, because North Dakota is the terminus of this project. It's the storage zone or carbon waste dump, if you will. So why was North Dakota picked of all places, right? I mean, it's just a strange thing for North Dakota to be the one that's picked for storing carbon. So looking back since like 2018, our government has been working for several years to welcome projects like the Summit Pipeline and other carbon capture projects. And they did this first by getting jurisdiction over sequestration wells with the EPA, which is called Class 6 injection. And then at the same time, they were funneling money into research from the Department of Energy to research at University of North Dakota's Energy and Environmental Research Center, which is also known as EERC, to find a place in North Dakota to geologically store the carbon for coal plants and other industries. And we as an organization, Dakota Resource Council, have opposed the Class 6 permit at the EPA level, and then also opposed a lot of this research that was being done. And specifically, there's a quote from this summer from Justin Kerhoff, from president of Summit Ag Investors, regarding why they chose North Dakota. And this is what the quote says: "We evaluated a number of areas, and North Dakota was the obvious choice. We've really become welcomed by the state. Governor Doug Burgum is very supportive of carbon capture and sequestration, and only 2 states have primacy over Class 6 wells. North Dakota and Wyoming are the only 2 that have regulatory jurisdiction over those wells." So what he's saying there is that we raced to the bottom first. So I want to apologize on behalf of North Dakota for creating the environment that got this project started in the first place. So what's currently happening in North Dakota, and what are we doing, I guess, is probably the next thing that you guys probably want to hear. So what we're seeing in our state is they are drilling test wells right now for the injection site, which is just north of Bismarck, near Beulah, North Dakota, and Mercer County, and then also in McLean County. And our government is, not only are they cheerleading for this, they're also funding it. And to do this, to facilitate using North Dakota taxpayer dollars to go to these projects, this last legislative session, they created what's now called the Clean Sustainable Energy Authority, which we called the Dirty Energy Authority, to provide companies that were, quote unquote, reducing emissions, i.e. fossil fuel companies, with approximately $250 million in loans and $25 million in grants every year. And what did our government do with the authority? They sat all of the fossil fuel executives on the authority to then grant money to themselves. As a result, we're watchdogging this process, and we're looking at potential legal angles to prevent the flow of this money. Recently, there was a meeting where none of the members of the board recused themselves when they were even voting for their own projects to receive funding. Unfortunately, what I'll say is that Midwest Ag Energy, which is one of the companies that's going to be doing the injection site, got I think a $3.5 million grant, and then some money loaned to them as well to do the test well. So unfortunately, our government is moving forward with giving them that money. As far as where the leasing is in North Dakota. Leasing is currently happening. Landowners are getting leases, and we're also seeing landowners getting leases for the injection zone. We're working just like DRA to try to organize a class of landowners to oppose the project, and we'll be meeting with some folks up near the injection zone probably after the first of the year. This is similar to any other project. We've been hearing the same things, like there's no way that this is a bad project. It's never going to spill. They're doing the same kind of bright, blue sky prognostications that they were doing during DAPL and other pipelines. So the things that we're going to do around this is obviously organize landowners along the pipeline route, work with indigenous communities to oppose the project along the route, watchdogging and scrutinizing the use of our taxpayer dollars that are being used for this project. And then we're looking at some other options, because part of the market that I've been hearing that's created this project is California's fuel standards that they're creating around ethanol. And I think there's some options to do some accountability with California. I'm not very hopeful on it, but to get the people in California to reject this project and this kind of way of reducing emissions to meet their fuel standards. So that's a lot of the things that we're doing, but we'll be organizing in the future. And obviously, we are the waste dump zone, and our governor and others are very supportive of that, which is really unfortunate. So I will apologize on the behalf of North Dakota for that fact, but that's pretty much all I have.
Mm-hmm. Now, Scott, I would like to make notice. I mean, we do have some wonky things going on where the government of Iowa is really supporting and pushing for this. You know, we saw Branstad, we see the current governor, Kim Reynolds, she's really pushing for it. We see even different people in state departments. We've got the State Geological Institute weighing in, saying, why aren't we storing the carbon here in Iowa? You know, it seems to be like there's a lot of government involvement and a lot of collusion between private industry and the government regarding pushing these projects through. I do know that you folks up there in North Dakota have the Century Code, and you've got a very important designation that you guys achieved early on of the state is actually going to be in charge of managing these types of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So they have EPA, it's what the legal term would be, EPA primacy over the Class 6 wells. So one thing I'll say is that if you ever hear of your environmental departments in any of the states along the route that are talking about adding another sequestration zone or getting the Class 6 permit, please, please, please oppose it and throw as much legal at it as possible, because that's going to put you guys essentially in the crosshairs for being in a zone for injection. The reason North Dakota originally did it was for coal power plants to do carbon capture, but then they saw opportunities with other industries, and that's why Wyoming has this as well. But yeah, that really opened it up for the ethanol industry to look at North Dakota and other states that have Class 6 as options. So I would just definitely say try to watchdog that and make sure that you are trying to stop your state from getting that primacy over Class 6.
Thank you so much, Scott. You know, this talk about North Dakota is a very important part of this whole thing. And so, you know, we really appreciate you being here and taking the time. And I'm happy to say that we got Lisa online. So I'm going to add her to the stream, and I'm going to take you off, but then if you want to stick around, I'm going to put everybody up for a few minutes so we can all maybe go through a few questions that might be in here. So thank you. Give me a sec here. All right.
I'll go ahead and introduce her again just to make sure everybody's familiar. Lisa DeVille is a longtime environmental activist in North Dakota, fighting to get protections for her community surrounding the impacts of oil and gas. Lisa is from the Mandaree, North Dakota, on the Fort Berthold Reservation, and is an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation, the 3 affiliated tribes.
And Lisa, there you are. Yeah, I was going to say her video might not be working. Oh, I think she's frozen. Let's you know, Mahmud, let's talk about Satartia for a minute.
Okay. While we're waiting for Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and mention Satarsha, Mississippi. Now, I did write there in the comments, there was an excellent piece published in HuffPo by a gentleman by the name of Dan Zigart. And we've been in contact with him as well. We're all organizing on a national level as well as regionally here against these two projects in particular. He detailed in great in great fashion, you know, the disaster which unfolded down there. I'll remind everybody that Satarsha, Mississippi, is a community of roughly 60% Caucasian and 40-some% African Americans. So again, we see environmental racism playing out, something very similar with what happened with the Dakota Access pipeline up in North Dakota. If you all recall, the Dakota Access pipeline was slated to pass very near Bismarck, a predominantly white community. And once the people found out and got hip to what was going on, they decided to go ahead and reroute it much closer to the reservation of Standing Rock. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of these corporations do. They pollute and they put people and externalize risks primarily on people of color and people economic disadvantage. With regard to Standing Rock, you know, it was some feet away from their water intake. I think that the similar situation played out with KXL regarding Cheyenne River, Sioux Tribe Reservation. And, you know, this is a day and age when, you know, we're way past the civil rights movement. You know, it's 30, 40 years removed. And I can't believe that this is still something that's occurring here in these United States.
Absolutely. And, you know, we need to, and this is why I'm so excited. So Lisa's going to talk through my speaker because she's on the road. And this is why I'm so happy that we have Lisa here, because we really need representation from Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara folks, as we know that this is where there are numerous caverns where oil has been extracted. It's not said that the oil is, or the CO2 liquid is going to be injected there exactly, but we all know that that's a threat. So thank you so much for joining us today, Lisa.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Lisa, Mahmud, can you hear Lisa speaking?
Yes, we can hear it loud and clear.
Solve the problem. All right. Go ahead, Lisa.
So, just like you guys all introduced me as, I am an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, but my direct descendancy is the Mandan and Hidatsa people. So, I and my family, we are lifelong residents of Mandaree, that is on Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, and that is where we live in the front lines of the Bakken oil and gas extraction. So we get to witness everything that comes with it, you name it, environmental impacts, health impacts, social impacts. I mean, it's all there. As we discussed the Dakota Access pipeline, I would like to say about that is that Dakota Access pipeline starts 7 miles west of Mandaree, in my community, Mandaree. We were never given the opportunity to give a public comment on that, of it being located there. We ask continuously, you know, we asked every government that we have to deal with. There's 3, 4 forms of government that we deal with. Our own tribal, the federal, the state, I mean, even county that we have to deal with in order to get answers. So I am the co-creator of the grassroots group called Fort Berthold Protectors of Water and Earth Rights, known as POWER. And I feel it's Dakota Resource Council. Fort Berthold POWER was created in 2014 to address the oil and gas impacts it has on our health, our environment, and all living things. And we continue to work on strong regulations and elevate the tribal citizens' concerns on these issues. I was asked to speak today because this pipeline is proposed to go through North Dakota. This pipeline project is no different than any other pipeline project industry is going to use. It's going to say this is the best and safest project ever, when in reality, all pipelines spill or break. My experience with oil and gas pipelines in my area proves this to be the case. I have seen numerous pipelines spill, and the results are devastating. This pipeline is no different. This project does not help fix climate change, as its proponents claim. Sorry, excuse me. In my view, it will just prolong the fossil fuel industry into the future. It's also likely that the CO2 stored from this project will later be used to extract more oil from under my homelands through enhanced oil recovery. This will cause more impacts for my community and contribute further to the climate crisis. This we cannot afford. Unfortunately, North Dakota state government is supportive of this project. This is because North Dakota government, and more specifically our government, seems to think dumping a bunch of carbon underground is an economic development strategy. But at DRC and Fort Berthold Power, we do not agree. This is why we will oppose the project as it tries to move through North Dakota. We will plan to work with landowners, indigenous communities, and concerned citizens to strongly oppose the project. But I also wanted to add that we did a study we were the second largest bill in North Dakota in 2014. And I took that study from Duke University and it was a wastewater spill that the pipeline broke for a couple of days. It was over 1 million gallons. I took that study, and when I lobbied or when I advocated opposing the Keystone and opposing the Dakota Access pipeline, I used that study to prove that no pipeline is safe. And this is what's happening to our environment or to our land that's never been cleaned up. It's still sitting back there and just like, the brine slowly kills everything around it. But yeah, I mean, they still feel our people's having our people try to believe that they have the safest way to do it. And I mean, still trying to fill our kids' heads up, still coming to the schools. I mean, you name it, it's all there. And I'm here to educate our people on that. It's not safe, and that they're going to keep doing that and filling your head up that it's going to be okay, but it's not. But people are finally realizing, all the education that we have been trying to, that we've been pushing to teach our future generations. So, but with that, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you for all the extra effort you made to be here.
Okay.
Bye-bye. All right. So we have gotten through all of our guests. I am really happy to see the engagement and all of the wonderful things that our guests have had to say today. I'm going to add everybody to the stream. Hello, everybody. There we go. So thank you for sticking with us. This has gone a little bit over. We wanted to be done by 7:30, but we have some amazing questions, and I just, I'm hoping that if you guys don't mind, because you are definitely experts in many different realms, that maybe you could answer a few of these questions. One of them that's really been sticking in my mind, that I've been storing the questions as we go, is about rescue groups. Mary Knox actually asked this question, and I'll put it down here. And she was asking, like, are these people going to be trained if one of these pipelines ruptures? This is a much different situation than an oil spill, an oil rupture, because this will actually asphyxiate people. So what's the deal with that if there's an emergency? Maybe I can ask Carolyn that question.
Sure. So here's the big problem. None of the first responders will have what they need. They won't have the information they need. They won't have the equipment they need. And when they raise it as part of the permitting process, the company will say, we'll take care of you. And so they will make private donations to these government entities, which then makes those government entities, whether it's the fire department or the police department, dependent on a private corporation. So why are we not adequately funding the first responders as a government matter? Why do we allow these private corporations to write a check and have access to the first responders and making them a charity? We should not be doing that. They will not have the information they need. They will not have the equipment they need unless they are the charity of Bruce Rastetter. So the other thing that we saw was, particularly in North Dakota with Dakota Access, this was stated in the Iowa Utility Board's hearings when Boone County objected to the Dakota Access pipeline because they wouldn't have adequate first responders, either equipment, training, what have you. They actually told us about funding the first responder departments in North Dakota to such an extent that they actually provided the personnel. So when you think about exercising your First Amendment rights as a landowner, First Nations, as DRC or DRA or Great Plains Action or the Science and Environmental Health Network or the Sierra Club, they are going to be beholden to those companies. And they may actually have access to those government records because they're providing the personnel, as they did in North Dakota. And that is deeply troubling when we actually make government by and for private corporations rather than by and for the people.
And I also want to ask this question to Michelle, who's worked, in the past in the law enforcement realm and, on the reservation. Are people going to be, I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think people would be trained to deal with one of these pipelines if they ever explode?
No, I doubt very highly that they'll have the funding or the training or the equipment even to even respond to something like this. One of the gentlemen somebody talked about how the fuel burning vehicles wouldn't even work. You wouldn't even be able to get a fire truck, an ambulance, or a police car to and from a scene like that. And the breathing apparatus as well would, it might get you in there, but it might not get you out. So there's going to be, they would have to develop an entire different response team in order to deal with something like that. And it would be my opinion that they'd have to probably rescue the rescuers first, because it's going to be hard to keep those people out. Especially if it's in a populated area, they're going to want to try to help. And it's a disaster in the making.
Yeah, if you're going to live by one of these, I guess you should get a gas mask. I don't know. That's the only answer I have at the moment for that. Thank you so much for your answers, Carolyn and Michelle. The next question that somebody asked that I think is important is, are there additives and impurities and other poisons within this liquefied CO2? Which is a very good question because, as we know, with tar sands, and bitumen, that's filled with all sorts of carcinogens as well. Who would like to answer that question?
Well,
go ahead, Carolyn. Thank you.
So Summit Carbon Solutions is saying that this is going to be pure CO2, that they won't have hydrogen sulfide, which is what was in the Satarsha pipeline, in addition to the carbon dioxide. The problem was the hydrogen sulfide and the impurities actually let people know that they were breathing something that was terrible. So we were given our eyes and ears and nose and mouth and fingers to detect problems. And the problem with CO2, with 100% CO2, is you can't smell it. So you can't use our innate biological warning system to know that something is wrong. So unlike Satarsha, where you had the hydrogen sulfide, which is a nasty chemical, but so is CO2. And so we won't have those warnings, and you'll be hit by something, you won't be able to breathe, and you won't know why.
Well, that's, sorry, it's just really scary. It feels like something like out of a science fiction book. So it's like hard to hear this sometimes. I have a question.
If I could add something.
Yeah, please do.
When you were suggesting that everybody get a gas mask, what the CO2 would do is displace the oxygen. So even having a gas mask wouldn't help.
What? Wow. Okay. So
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think that what Michelle's speaking of is, it's along the lines of carbon monoxide poisoning, where you'd actually need to get like a blood transfusion. You couldn't just get, moved out into clear air and kind of recover on your own.
So the people in Satartia, some of them have lifelong illnesses now.
Scarring of the lungs and so on. And I'd remind everyone that the Satartia accident occurred, early 2020, right at the beginning as COVID started ravaging the United States and became the global pandemic. Certainly, that's not going to be good for anybody's health and well-being to have compromised, pulmonary functioning amidst a global pandemic, which is a pulmonary respiratory disease.
Okay, so that's another whole conversation that we don't have time for at the moment. But thank you for your answers. And I want to move to a question to Brian, asked by Amanda Lanos. If the project is stopped in one state, will that call off the entire project, or do all states impacted have to prevent this?
Oh, we've got him muted.
Oh,
Just
I
one
think
moment,
you're
Brian.
muted. Sorry. I've been muting everybody just so you know, so it's clearer for all the other speakers.
There we go. You should have a live mic now.
Great, thank you. Excellent question. So if you look at a map and understand that the terminus is North Dakota, imagine if somehow it could be stopped in North Dakota, well, then they would have to go back to the drawing board of where this is all going to be stored. Now, unfortunately, it looks like North Dakota has rolled out the red carpet and that there's quite an uphill battle on that. But again, theoretically, if you could stop it there, it could be stopped. Then backing it up, if you could stop it in South Dakota, the northern part of South Dakota, the gateway into North Dakota, where it has to ultimately be stored, then that would also set the dominoes in motion. So if the starting point is southern central Iowa and parts of Nebraska, and then feeding up into Minnesota, South Dakota, if we simply work backwards from the only location where they're proposing to store this and could set up roadblocks at any of those places just south of the location, the storage location, then yes, theoretically, there's no path to get to the terminus. So yeah, it's just be strategic, look at the map, and you can figure out the kind of the key areas of real estate, so to speak, where the battles could be very strategic to slow down or kill the ultimate project.
And
Okay.
I would like to add that, in the KXL fight, Nebraska, we put up a mighty stand, and we kind of got in their way, tying them up in the legal process and in the courts. Even when states like North Dakota, South Dakota were on board and pretty much passed and gave the green light.
So I'll add one other thing too. They believe this is going to work, but they don't know that in North Dakota. They have not done this at the scale that they're talking about. They've only done test wells. So I'll just say that right now. This is still very, very, very experimental. They're very bullish on how they're describing this publicly, because there's lots of federal dollars associated with this research that they've been doing, and they want to look good for the Department of Energy and other investors. But the truth is, no one's ever done this at the scale that they're looking at doing this in North Dakota. So there's a lot of things that have to happen correctly. I'm not saying that we bet on that, but there is also that element to this too, that this is unproven.
And I'd like to add more to what you're saying here, Scar, to ask you to speak a little more, so we can kind of talk about this question somewhat. So, we all know, well, what's happening in Iowa right now is Iowa corporations are starting to realize that they can make a lot of money with carbon capture. So now they're actually looking into geology here in the southwest and saying, hey, we can actually store it here. So some of that talk is happening. However, what might be happening in North Dakota? Like, are people talking about storing it there as well? I know the origin point is here for Iowa, but are there thoughts about also storing carbon as well from plants and such there?
Yes, I mean, what they're looking at doing in North Dakota is the governor calls it monetizing carbon. I remember meeting with his policy advisor like 3 years ago, and he told me their wacky idea, and I thought it was not possible, but we had opposed a lot of it throughout the years. But yeah, this is something they're looking at, creating a carbon storage hub in North Dakota to monetize carbon markets. And that's what they're specifically saying. And they are literally, this is not just some little mom and pop thing. They're courting capital from Saudi Arabia, Japan, trying to get blue hydrogen hubs, all kinds of different things in North Dakota where they can store carbon, specifically in that McLean County, Mercer County area near Lake Sikowis, near the Missouri River. And I think the reason I was hearing about the Missouri River stuff is I think there's geology along the Missouri River that's supposedly is advantageous for storage, is what they're saying. So that's why you're hearing it from your geologist in Iowa. But that's what we're hearing about North Dakota. That's what our governor's been planning, and they've been going out and trying to get the money for it. The Commerce Director, James Lamont, has been all over the world looking for money for this.
And Frank, have you been hearing about any of this in South Dakota?
Not to that level, no. I don't know. I suppose if they we had another crazy thing in the central part of the state where there was a company that wanted to drill holes to explore storing nuclear waste deep underground. So I suspect that we have the makeup for this sort of storage within our state, but it's just, for whatever reason, probably some of the stuff that Scott was talking about were not the target location. And then, we are the home to many of these ethanol plants that are going to be sending CO2 through this pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I can't imagine them storing this in Nebraska. And I don't know if you've heard anything about Nebraska, Michelle or Mahmud, or Brian, but I cringe thinking about the Ogallala Aquifer and how that provides drinking water for millions and millions of people downstream.
Yeah, both the Ogallala Aquifer, I believe they call it the High Plains Aquifer up in the South Dakota portion, as well as the Missouri River. That is a lifeline to millions of Americans, at least 16 plus million Americans downstream. We're playing with something that's largely science fiction, as somebody mentioned earlier. This is unproven technology, and they're trying to have a go at it with over 2,000 mile long pipeline. I believe there's currently 5,000 miles worth of pipeline total, and this one summit project amounts to 2,000 miles. So it's a huge project by anybody's standard.
Let me just address the South Dakota issue. And they have done research. They have geologically suitable areas in Nebraska, but apparently the politics don't lend itself so far. But they have looked both at western Nebraska and eastern Nebraska for storing carbon. I think that they've looked at every state but Minnesota and done some research on storing carbon long term. So it's Illinois, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska are all in the crosshairs for possible long-term storage.
I would like to add an aside, from an Indigenous perspective, and perhaps Carolyn can elaborate on this. I think that something that we're going to have to really activate a lot of our tribal communities on are to push the rights of nature and the rights of the river, the rights of the Missouri. I think up in Buhl, North Dakota, as well as southwestern Iowa and in Nebraska, it would be right along the Missouri River.
We actually have a question in that realm asked by Heidi. And so, we absolutely do need to push the rights of nature. I don't know exactly. I mean, I know there is some work being done by the Hewangtawan folks on that. But Michelle, are any Winnebago and Omaha folks working on rights of nature for the Missouri?
No, not right now. Not yet.
And I know that we are starting something up here for the Mississippi. We'll be hosting a conference next year pertaining to that exactly, actually, which I'm excited to talk more about at a later date. But we definitely need to move into that realm. I would think. Thank you for your question, Heidi.
And not just that as well. I think that an important consideration is for us to think about the folks downstream. We're starting to form a coalition as well with a lot of folks in the Gulf region, particularly in Louisiana. And I think that we cannot ignore, we'd be remiss if we do not bring to mind that the fact that this would lock in ethanol as not a bridge fuel, what it was intended to be, but more of a permanent kind of piece. That's going to surround issues of monocropping. It's going to issue big ag, GMO things like that, as well as the chemicals that we're all using and flushing down both the Missouri and the Mississippi. As you know, Sikowis, from your research and your work on the agricultural industry here in Iowa, we're contributing something like 60 to 70% of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Iowa is, yeah. I have a question for Brian. Oh,
could I just follow up on the question about the rights of nature?
Absolutely.
There is a bridge idea, which is that we have a right to a.
Oh, 1 second here. We're having a little bit of interference. I'm just going to mute everybody but Carolyn. Okay, go ahead.
So Illinois has a constitutional provision that recognizes that each member of the community has a right to a clean and healthy environment. And some constitutions like Hawaii or Pennsylvania parallel that right to a clean and healthy environment with the duty of the state to protect the natural resources. And that is an idea that we can extend to, more broadly. Why should Illinoisans have a right to a clean and healthy environment when just a few miles across the border in Iowa, I don't have that right? And why don't I share that right with nature, with future generations? So we can build on those existing constitutional provisions that grant a right to a clean and healthy environment and make sure that it's enforced, that we make the case that CO2 pipelines threaten that right to a clean and healthy environment.
Thank you for that.
And can I speak to the ethanol issue just a little bit?
Absolutely.
This is really dangerous for farmers as well, because just based on the projected sales of electric cars and the decision being made by car manufacturers to do away with the internal combustion engine, there are projections of a drop in corn demand in the next 10, 15 years of 30%. And instead of dealing with that, and that has nothing to do with whether we build this pipeline or not, that's because of the buying choices of the American public and what cars they're going to be buying in the future and what's going to be offered. We all probably should be dealing with that issue as agriculture, about what do we do if there's a drop in demand for corn by 30%? How does that change our agricultural practices? What kind of programs do we need developed at the federal level, at the state level, to address that, instead of messing around with this kind of stuff?
That's a really good point. We have to start understanding that this is all very much connected, and doing more work in that realm for sure. And so, Brian, can you answer this question? Has Summit done pipelines before? Oh, hold on. Let me unmute you. There you go.
No, so Summit Carbon Solutions was formed in 2020, specifically to try to make money off the carbon tax credits and other federal initiatives. It doesn't own or operate any pipelines of any kind, let alone carbon pipelines. So this truly is an experimental project with no track record of success.
Okay.
So we're all largely guinea pigs, the people in the way.
We are. And I mean, I feel like I don't know if we described exactly what's happening, like how there's two pipeline systems coming in. I feel like we've talked a lot, but just to be clear, Summit is owned by Bruce Rastetter, who is a notorious villain, in my opinion, someone who has brought in CAFOs and ethanol plants into Iowa, and who's done some pretty horrible things in Africa, displacing refugees for private gain. And here he is now bringing in these CO2 pipelines to profit off of those, and with very little to no real background on what these can possibly do. And so the headquarters of Summit are actually located in Ames, Iowa, and we've been there, a few of us already. If you go to our page, you'll see a graphic with some pictures we took. And the other pipeline, maybe somebody can fill us in on that, because I'm not so up to date on Navigator. I can't even remember the parent company of Navigator.
Navigator Ventures LLC, and they're proposing a pipeline project called the Heartland Greenway. And that one is going to be sequestering or storing their carbon in the state of Illinois. So it's going to be affecting mainly Nebraska as well as Iowa.
Okay. I just wanted to put that out there for the audience, just so we can make sure we're still understanding exactly what's going on here. And I just want to give everybody like a minute to just say something if you'd like, and then we're going to close up here, because we went 2 hours, but man, people are still going strong on here. Frank, would you like to say something in closing?
Just thank you, and I would like to remind everyone that these are early days. The fight over Keystone XL was 12 years is a conservative estimate of how long we worked on that. So I think we're in good company. I know I'm in good company, and it's a bad thing to have to always fight this stuff, but at least we're with good people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to build off of something Frank mentioned. If you all recall, former CEO of TransCanada Keystone XL project there was Russ Girling, and he famously remarked that he believes the opposition to the Keystone project would dissipate over time. Well, 10, 12 years into it, many of us were still involved and very actively so. And ultimately, we saw that was defeated, first by Barack Obama. It was overturned by Donald Trump, and then ultimately it was stopped again by Joe Biden. Not to bring it into a political matter, but it just didn't make good sense. It wasn't right for Nebraskans. It wasn't right for South Dakotans or North Dakotans or the indigenous communities along the route.
Thank you, Mahmud. Scott, would you like to say something?
I think this is a really energizing meeting, just to see all the people that are paying attention to this, and we don't feel alone in North Dakota, obviously, anymore, and keep fighting in Iowa. We've been watching all the media hits that have been happening around the hearings, and you guys are doing really good work out there. So everywhere along the line, I mean, we haven't gotten to the place you guys are at yet, but keep fighting, because I don't want this thing.
Michelle?
Yeah, only thing that I'd like to, that I think everybody should keep in mind is the word stewardship. It has to do with the relationship we all have with our grandmother Earth, and we also have to keep in mind that that sense of stewardship doesn't end at the topsoil or down far as bedrock. I mean, it's the entire Earth all the way through, and we never know what we're going to trigger when we start messing around with injecting things deep into the Earth. Our grandmother doesn't need us, but we need her, so we need to behave ourselves.
Absolutely. Carolyn?
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I want to second what Frank said. We're in good company. And I hope that this is not a 12-year struggle. But if it is, this is 2021, on the verge of 2022. And I will host the party in 2034 at my house. I will provide all the food and beverages. My house is currently big enough because I was trying to duplicate what it felt like outside North Dakota, inside my house, to host you all. And you can all sleep here and gather around my wood stove. But we're in this together. We are in this together. And I pledge the best of what I am to this struggle and to you all. It is such an honor to work with each one of you, and to know that we are not alone in this. We are not alone. Don't despair.
Thank you. Brian.
Yeah, this is the best organized and connected ground roots beginning opposition to any major infrastructure pipeline project that I'm familiar with in the last decade or more. So that is exciting. At the same time, as we're talking, these companies are strategizing with way more money than we have and a lot of people behind them. And so get noisy, like we've talked about. That's people always ask, well, I'm not an affected landowner. What can I do? You can get noisy, meaning talk to anyone that'll listen and know your audience, right? Be tactical about how you try to persuade people. This is all about the persuasion business and persuading the media to care, the IUB or whatever utility boards are involved to care, the courts to ultimately care if they're asked to look over this and any of decisions that are made. And that all starts with the amount of people in each community that are getting noisy enough to make this a topic of everyday conversation. And don't forget the landowners themselves. We have to get to them immediately. That should be the number one goal, because if they're busy signing voluntary easements, our job gets harder and harder and harder. So encourage any farmers, landowners, to hold out, ask questions. This is an untested pipeline with an untested operator and not very good means to end here. And so get everyone questioning this and try to hold out as long as we can as we're developing all the great strategies, both legally, environmentally, from an indigenous perspective, et cetera, so that we can put our best foot forward collectively.
I do have one thing that I'd like to ask for Mr. Jordy to address for some of the landowners that may be tuned in. I think it's very important that we stress that nobody sign any easements. We remind a united front, and that we certainly do not allow any surveyors onto the properties.
Yeah, so just briefly on that, you wouldn't sign a contract that someone puts in front of you for something you didn't ask for, you don't want, you didn't seek out, and you don't need, and you don't understand. So landowners, we're in the Midwest, we trust, right? We're good people. We assume that those coming to us come in good faith. You cannot assume that with pipeline companies, with the land agents, with the people involved. I'm sorry, you can't. Don't sign anything. There's no rush. There's no rights take your land yet. No eminent domain's been vested in any state. The critical approvals haven't even been applied for, let alone granted. So please hold out. Don't do them any favors by allowing them into your home, into your land. Think of them as telemarketers calling to sell you something you don't want, and do not deal with them whatsoever, please.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And I want to, as people are asking, how they can get involved, and just remember that, yes, right now the focus is on landowners because that's the first front. But that, like, if these pipelines rupture, leak, whatever, that affects everybody. And so, like, this is about our drinking water. This is about our health, literally our lives, in the case of these CO2 pipelines. And also these go through stolen land. They go through indigenous territories, and we have a say. And so, keep in touch with, you can keep in touch here on Great Plains. Please check out the Science and Environmental Health Network. That's the organization that Carolyn directs. And then we have Dakota Rural Access. We have, we have Dakota. There's two Dakotas. Scott, please rep your org here.
Dakota Rural Action.
It is Dakota Rural Access.
No, Frank and I work together, but Frank,
yes.
Go ahead.
But then we have Dakota Rural Action.
Dakota Resource Council, Dakota Rural
Resource
Action.
Council. Yes.
We've
Thank
The
you.
last letter in the name of the first word in the name is
I
A,
know.
B. And so Dakota Rural Action is first because, of course, South Dakota, and then there's Dakota Resource Council.
Yes, which is in North Dakota.
Exactly.
Sorry about that, everybody. I apologize. And we have the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective. Please, follow what they're doing. I don't know, Michelle, if there's any. Well, there's Nebraska Stand, but if there's any folks in Nebraska we should be watching, let us know.
Yeah, for Nebraska, the Nebraska Easement Action Team, the Bold Nebraska website or Bold Alliance, and we're looking to develop those same kind of groups in the other states if they want them. Nonprofits that can accept donations that are tax deductible, that work on landowner education and education for others and uniting people. So again, we're in the midst of trying to put all these together. But I would just say, for the organizers of this great event, the more the email addresses and people we can connect and hold together so that this continues not just as lots of separate great groups, but building one connected group would be amazing.
Yeah, we've been working on it. We've created a group for Iowa and one for Nebraska now. We'd love to see something in South Dakota and North Dakota as well. And then plus, I cannot forget to mention the Sierra Club in Iowa. They've been doing an amazing job working with the landowners. So if you are a landowner, I would highly suggest you contact them. And then you can get involved with other landowners that are going through this similar situations. I really hope I haven't missed anybody. If I have, please say their name right now.
Just as an aside, the primary landowner organizer for Sierra Club is Jess Mazur. She's a juggernaut. She's been out
Food
there
and
in
Water
the field.
Watch. Yeah, Food
and
and
Water Watch as well. Emma Schmidt. These two gals, they're tireless in their pursuit to get the information out to the public, to bring the fight to Summit, to bring the fight to Navigator. And I have nothing but praise to sing about them.
Oh yeah, and then the Twin Cities. Somebody just put a comment in here that they are organizing around this in Minnesota, and so is Cure River. I'm not sure what organization that is, but thank you. Yes, we do know that this is happening in Minnesota. We just haven't had a lot of contact with folks there, but please hit me up, Sikowis at greatplainsaction.org. You can find my email on our website, and I'd be happy to talk to you and connect everybody, and let's do this. So thank you so much.
The lead organizer in Minnesota is Peg Fershon.
Okay. All right. Good to know. So we are going to do more of this, and we are going to have more conversations with folks in Minnesota for sure. I want to say thank you to all of you. It was an honor to be on here with you, and like to be here on this, to be on this for, this long is a privilege. So thank you. Ahai kitata mahin, and Mahmud, if you want to say something to close it out, we'll end there.
All I can say is that we're forming a united front early on, and standing together in firm opposition, remaining united, moving in lockstep, coordinating our efforts along the entirety of the projects are going to be key to us defeating this. They may have the money, but we have the people. And from fights like KXL and unlikely alliances that are formed, such as rural folks, environmentalists, farmers, ranchers, agriculturalists, and of course the indigenous nations, we can beat this thing.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, you're still on there. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Great job.
From a lawyer, we never get a lawyer's time like this. So thank you.
No, hey, I